That's a very interesting question because it's actually hard at the moment to give you that sort of precise answer. Yes, I'm bullish and provide a list of reasons why, or, oh no, things are looking bad, I'm bearish. I think there's a very mixed picture at the moment. There are certain aspects which would seem quite bullish, and then there are others that are not. On the bullish side, I think we've still got quite strong demand from India for both thermal and coking coal. I think we're seeing reasonable demand from the rest of Asia, excluding China. Now, China is your interesting situation when it comes to coal demand this year, because it's effectively becoming very much a policy-driven market. And unless you have tremendous insight into the thinking of the policy people in Beijing, it's becoming it's a lot harder to predict what's going to happen. I think it's quite obvious that China still has a market and a desire for imported coal. Whether they'll be allowed to bring it in or not is far from clear. If you just look at the last couple of months, we've had December, they cracked down on imports. That led to a rebound in January, particularly from Indonesia. Now it appears that they're cracking down on imports again in the current month, February into March, into April, and Australia's suffering out of that rather than Indonesia. So given that China is the world's largest importer of coal, what happens there drives the market, drives the pricing, drives the sentiment. And at the moment, we're not getting a consistently clear signal from China. So that makes me uncertain. So I think if all things were equal, it would be quite easy to be bullish on coal. But at the moment, all things aren't quite equal. So that makes me cautious without necessarily being bearish. I think there's two main sort of factors. One is, as we've talked a bit about, the direction of policy in China, and the other is what happens in the domestic market in India. The Indian government has a clear and unambiguous policy of not wanting to import coal at all. That's not realistic, but they have an idea that they want to lower their coal imports, especially over time. That is contingent upon Coal India being able to meet domestic demand. It's not so much can Coal India mine the coal, it's can it get transported from where it's mined to where it's needed. And that's always been your consistent problem in India. So that has driven a fairly strong gain in imports in recent months in India. And I think the sort of unknown, if you want to put it that way, is will Coal India be able to improve its performance in coal evacuation? And if they do that, how much of that will it knock out of the of import demand? Certainly, in India, there's a base level of import demand. You have coastal power plants designed to run on imported coal. That's going to continue. That will provide a base level of demand. We're looking at, the sort of if Coal India struggles, then you could quite easily see imports go up. If Coal India succeeds, then you could actually see imports go down a little bit. So I think you've got a certain level of uncertainty in your two biggest importers in China and India, one on policy, one on sort of can they actually get their infrastructure working the way it should be. The rest of the region is fairly steady. Japan is a fairly steady buyer of coal. Their demand doesn't go up or down much. Korea is starting to move a little bit away from coal, but they will still be a fairly consistent buyer. There are emerging buyers in other parts of Asia, which will add some incremental demand. But nothing really is as important as what happens in China and India. And unfortunately, anybody who tells you they know exactly what's going on there is I would say, overstating their expertise. I certainly. So what you have to do is follow the data, make sure that you're watching very closely what is actually happening, and then you can sort of build up a picture. But it's difficult to say for certain which way both China and India will go this year. I think it will stabilize. The first quarter is always an interesting quarter in China because you've got the effect of the Lunar New Year. You've got it's coming to the end of winter. And then things tend to settle down and you get a better picture of what's going on throughout the year. One thing that you can say about China is it's not a certain thing, but they do tend to allow more imports when the price of their domestic coal gets too high. and they tend to restrict them when the price of domestic coal is falling, because they want to keep the domestic coal price in the sort of Goldilocks zone where it's high enough to ensure that the miners are able to continue to operate and service their debts, but not so high that the utilities are starting to feel the crunch on power prices. So there's tremendous debate as to what that exact level is. I would say it's somewhere in the sort of 580 to 600 yuan a ton range. So if you're looking at the domestic price and it's sort of in that level, then you would expect kind of steady imports in China. But if it moves either way, then imports can either rise or go down according to which way the price has moved in the domestic market. It's also kind of key to look at the level of stockpiles at power plants, not so much at ports, although that's important too, just to get an idea of how tight the market is in China. If it shows signs of tightening, then you will get imports coming in. The broader trend is that seaborne supply in Asia is going to be increasingly constrained. It's now very hard, possibly even impossible, to do a greenfield brand new mine in Australia. All you have to do is look at the struggles of Adani to get their Carmichael mine up and running. I wouldn't count them out just yet, but I would say they've taken a lot of body blows, and the fight is far from over. Will they ever get that mine running? I would say at the moment it would still have to be a doubtful. There's also a potential political change in Australia this year at our federal election. And if the Liberal Party loses and the Labour Party comes in, that will make doing coal mining, new projects even harder. So if you're looking at Australia, which is the biggest exporter of coal, if you include thermal and coking together, it's going to be hard to see much more supply coming from them. Incrementally, they can do a few more tons here and there, but big increases of 30, 40 million tons a year, very hard to see. The other big exporter in the region is obviously Indonesia. Here you have kind of contradictory aims at the moment. They want to lower their amount of exports in order to preserve coal for their domestic market. And they have a policy of that they will reduce coal exports over time. But at the same time, they're having a little bit of a foreign exchange crunch, and they want to improve their balance of payments. And one way of doing that is selling stuff that earns you dollars, coal earns you dollars. So you're getting sort of contradictory messaging out of Indonesia at the moment. How that shapes up in actual exports is, I think you might see this year, maybe next year, the possibility of higher exports from Indonesia, but they're not going to be dramatically higher. We're not talking 50, 60 million tons. We're talking relatively small volumes. As far as the rest of the world that supplies into the Asian markets, South Africa's capacity constrained. They're not going to do much more than they currently are. They're sort of in the range of 75, 76 million tons. Yes, their terminal can do 91 is its nameplate, but they're struggling a bit with that. You could get more coal coming from the US. That is a distinct possibility, particularly into the Indian market. That might work. You could get some more coming from Russia. The Russians are building more coal mines. Again, that can come into the Pacific Basin either through their Pacific ports or through the Black Sea and into Asia that way. I think there's a definite possibility of increasing supplies from Russia. But at the moment, it's really hard to see where. If there is going to be greater coal demand in Asia, it's actually quite hard to see where a lot of those tons are going to come from. I've been going to Coaltrans Asia for, I think this will be my 12th year in a row. I've always found it a very useful event. It does bring together possibly the broadest range of people in the coal industry in Asia, everything from the miners through to the traders, the bankers, and the end users. It is a place where you can reestablish your relationships, make new ones, and it's a useful event. Specifically this year, I think the last few years we've seen a recovery in the coal sector. From the doldrums and the 5 lost years from 2011 to 2016. The last couple of years have actually been relatively good for the industry. Rising prices has helped them. Now I think we're entering the possibility of a period of some uncertainties again and volatilities. And when that happens, it's always good to get together with your colleagues and peers in the industry and just sort of collectively put your heads together and see if you can work out what's happening. And Coaltrans Asia is one of the events where that's definitely possible.